Hello everyone and welcome to one of the first collabs for assessment A1b, which is called Planning for Diverse Learners. So as you would know, you can choose from this assessment, or you can also choose from another planning assessment, which is develop and evaluate a lesson plan. There's also a flip collaborate about that one, so if you're interested in that assessment, head to the Padlet and there will be a link to that flip collaborate as well. But today in this collaborate we are talking about planning for diverse learners. We'll talk about what that means and how to help you get started. This assessment is due in week 9, which is Monday the 9th of September, and we will be having a interactive collaborate as well in week 6. So I've decided to structure this flip collaborate in the same way that we structured it last time. So it's not an in-depth analysis of everything that needs to be included, because the aim of this is to not have you have to listen to an hour-and-a-half presentation by me. It's just a quick 30-minute video that helps you to get started with Rachel's top 5 things. What we're also encouraging is that you do try to come along to the interactive collab in week 6 so that we can brainstorm ideas together and talk through issues and talk through questions. So definitely come to that, or at least listen to the recording of that, because it will add on to what we've started here really nicely. So I had a look at the assessment and broke it down into 5 key things that I think you need to know to get started in this assessment. And we're looking at number 1, which is area diversity. Number 2 is pedagogical practices. Number 3 is inclusion methods. Number 4 is inclusive assessment. And number 5 is learning goals. And I have taken all of this information from the assessment details and the rubric. So let's get started. Now with this assessment, I'm assuming that you've already had a very good read of the assessment details yourself, and you will know that this assessment is based around a scenario of 3 students. We have Simon, who is generally does very well with literacy. He's ahead with his learning. I'm not going to read the whole scenario to you, because I'm sure you're capable of doing that yourself, but the data shows that he's well ahead. Both comprehension wise and writing. We have Hanin in that grade, who's a gorgeous girl. She is of ELA background. She's of Arabic descent, but she was born in Australia. The issues with her surround the fact that there could be some cultural things that are limiting her with her literacy, as well as lack of parental support at home, perhaps. And we have Tegan, who is struggling with both reading and writing, and that tests indicate that she's at risk. So have a closer look at the scenario yourself and read it in a bit more detail than what I've explained just there, but each of the students have particular needs and things that we need to focus on in this assessment. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is isolate each of the students' area of diversity. Now, with this assessment, we do not need to focus on all 3 students, but for the sake of this collaborate, I'm going to talk about all 3 at all times, because I don't know which 2 students you're going to select. But you just need to remember that you're only focusing on 2 of the 3 students here. Whether it's Tegan and Simon, whether it's Simon and Hanin, or Hanin and Tegan, it's completely up to you. But of course, today I need to talk about all 3 students, but you don't have to. So each of the students come to you in your grade 4 classroom, and as with any typical classroom, we all have kids who have different needs, and we need to be able to support them in their literacy journey and cater to them at the level they are, and hopefully provide some help and some support to students who need it, and also provide some challenge and some pushing of students who are capable of doing more, which is typical of any teacher in any classroom in any subject. So now that we have that scenario in front of us, we're able to isolate the fact that each of these students have particular needs. Now, these are not an extensive list. These are just some things that I've put together to help to get you started. So when I focused on Simon, I was thinking about the fact that he is above. and it seems like he's above in all areas of literacy. So it's going to be something that comes quite easy to him, and something that comes quite naturally, that he's just got a flair for literacy and reading and writing, and that he's working well above the expected grade level. My issues with him, something that I would identify as a teacher, is that with students who perhaps we wouldn't call them gifted, but when you're doing your research, it's probably a good idea to have a little look into gifted students and the issues that come up, or the issues that arise when you're teaching gifted students. So not that I think that Simon is gifted, I think he's just above, working above the grade level, but it's just good to help to see what the issues are when you're doing your research. So have a think about what the issues could be with Simon in regards to extending him with his learning. So my main issue with him is that students who are not challenged become disengaged. So that's my area of diversity that we're going to need to work on with him. We need to make sure that we're catering to him at his level. We need to make sure that we're pushing him on to, with the appropriate scaffolding around him, that he's able to do make steps towards the next level that he needs to be with. We need to remember that all students need to be making growth in our classrooms. So even though Simon's as ahead as he is, it doesn't mean that we want his results to stagnate. So if he is working at level 6 when he comes to us in grade 4, we still want to make sure that for 6 months of learning, he's had 6 months growth. Or for 12 months of learning, he has 12 months growth. So all students deserve to have that level of value added, I suppose is a good word. So my issues with him is that we need to challenge him, we need to engage him, and we need to keep pushing him to the next level to ensure that he meets that growth. So if we're not providing tasks that are at his level, he's going to become bored and disengaged, perhaps. That's my issue with Simon. Now, Hanin is a little bit different. She's an interesting one because she's one of those ones that probably teachers would focus on, because we feel like she's sort of on the cusp of being at risk and could sort of fall further behind if something wasn't done now. So the scenario is explaining to us that she's only, I think, 6 months behind. So she's really on that edge of being, if we just implement the right strategies with her, we'd be able to push her along and hopefully get her over the line to improve to where she needs to be. But by not implementing strategies or implementing the wrong strategies, we could end up with her further behind as she progressed, especially now that we're in grade 4 and a lot more is expected of us. You could find that that gap widens if the teacher doesn't step in now and implement some strategies with Hindi that's really going to help her with her learning. So the issues with her is that she is below the grade level, so we need to acknowledge that. And her issues are all based around the fact that she is an EAL student, so it means that she's got that cultural factors that are at play here. So it's going to mean things like primarily a lack of experience, potentially, with different concepts. Now, I know that this is all generalization, and it doesn't mean that every EAL student is going to come to you with these particular issues, but for the sake of this assignment, we're making the generalization that perhaps she hasn't been exposed to many different text types. If her parents are not able to read to her at home, even though they're very supportive and very willing, they're just not able to. So perhaps as in the lower grades, she wasn't able to have that support whilst reading at home. Maybe she wasn't able to read at home. Maybe in really those early years, she didn't have anyone read to her. So we can make those assumptions based on what the scenario is telling us, that there's most likely going to be a lack of text being introduced to her, and probably a lack of vocabulary as a result of that. These are going to be issues that are going to come up with her ability to interpret texts and her ability to be able to solve unfamiliar words, and her ability to draw on her own experiences. So when you think about all those, when you're dive into the literacy toolkit, and it talks about things like activating prior knowledge and using prediction. She's going to find some of those strategies really hard if she's got nothing to draw on from her own personal experiences, because how can you make connections to something that you haven't done? So it's going to be up to the teacher to sort of bridge that gap in this situation. So, you know, that she comes to you as she is. We can't make changes to the past, but we can think about what we can do with her now to broaden her knowledge of different text types, to broaden her knowledge of unfamiliar words, to broaden her strategies that she uses when she's reading, comprehending. Give her those strategies so that she's able to sort of make gains in that area. So we've got that she's working below the grade level. There's going to be issues to do with cultural and the fact that there was little help at home, and she may not understand some culturally specific concepts as well, because it can be tricky to read a book about cricket with cricket terms, or a book about being at the beach if you haven't been in those situations yourself. Tegan's situation is a little bit different. Now, even though they're both below expected grade level, I would handle the two situations differently. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't use the same pedagogical approaches for both girls, but you just will have different reasons for using them. So Tegan is also below, but she's further below than Hanin is at the moment. So that's already, somebody's come to your grade below, and it's already going to be the teacher sitting there thinking of what's the best plan of attack with Tegan. So from the scenario, we know that she's decoding quite well, so decoding is not an issue. That's not an area of diversity that we need to focus on, but comprehension is. So she's just not able to fully comprehend what she's reading. She's having some issues, maybe with using some of the strategies that she's been taught in previous years. And my issue to do with her is what we see with a lot of struggling students. So this would be worth doing some research around the disengagement that these particular students will feel. So you can imagine being in grade 4, she's quite lucky because she does decode well. So that's going to be, for students who don't decode well, it makes their issues more obvious and they become very self-conscious about reading in front of other people. But there will be a lack of motivation to participate, and potentially a lack of engagement if she feels like she's not making any inroads with her reading and not getting any better. We've got those sort of self-esteem issues as well that perhaps you could look into, that can happen when students are struggling. So when we're focusing on area of diversity, we're thinking about what it is that makes them different, what it is that they need, and what specific things, this leads into what specific things we're going to do for them to be able to cater for them in our classroom. As I said, this is not a comprehensive list, it's just some things that I came up with. So if you can think of other things that's an area of diversity, then you can include that in your assessment as well. So 30% of our mark, which incorporates learning goals, which I'll talk about on a separate slide, but 30% of our mark connects to pedagogical approaches. Now, you will be used to, regardless of which A1A you chose, the concept of pedagogical strategies or pedagogical approaches, whatever words are all used synonymously now. I think most people did a good job of isolating what pedagogical approaches are and being able to say, well, shared reading is a pedagogical approach, or visual thinking strategies is a pedagogical approach. So we're talking about the how of the teaching, not the what, how we're going to be able to teach these particular students. Now, most people were pretty good at isolating the pedagogical strategies in the unit that we had to evaluate for A1A, and I think most people would do a good job of choosing pedagogical strategies that they wanted to put in their unit, in the designer unit. What is tricky with this particular one, and I suppose it's adding to our level of skill, is not just choosing random pedagogical approaches. We have to actually now sit back and match pedagogical approaches to student need. So we should be able to see that you have considered what the child's needs are, because you've sat back and you've thought about all their areas of diversity, which is going to give you the basis of what they need. And now you're thinking about what pedagogical approach is best suited to the particular child's needs. So I sat back myself and thought about what things I would choose for each of the particular students. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. You can go off and choose much more. And what I've begun to realize is that some of the strategies can be used for all students, but it's the way you justify your choice that makes the selection correct. So there's not so much a wrong selection, but there is a wrong way of explaining, which I'll give you an example of over these next couple of students. So when we think about Simon and we think about what his needs are, of someone who needs to be challenged and someone who needs to have that value-added growth at a very high level, we need to keep him doing that. So when I'm thinking about pedagogical approaches for him, I'm really thinking of things that use quite high, I suppose, higher order thinking skills. I would expect him, if he's coming to me at a grade 6 level in grade 4, that he could do a lot of things that involved a lot of those higher order thinking skills. So I would choose for him something like literacy circles or reciprocal reading, because it asks you to have that element of independence where you're coming to the lesson prepared with notes and discussion material for other students, and you're preparing questions for other students that you're able to answer, but it's also not teacher driven. So it gives students like Simon, and there would be others in the group that you would say would be grouped appropriately. They would be able to almost run their own group, and the teacher could participate as well or watch whatever the focus was for that lesson. But you're giving students like Simon the chance to sort of take over that leadership role, take over the discussion, justify ideas, and really get them to have that sort of deeper level discussion that you would be expecting of a grade 6 student. I did literacy circles and reciprocal reading with a lot of my grade 5, 6s that I had for a few years. And of course, by that level, you've got students who are able to work at a 7 and 8 level. And we had some great discussions, some absolutely great discussions that really talked about themes and talked about the deeper levels of the text and sort of underlying issues. But we wouldn't have been able to tease those things out. Perhaps if another strategy was used, we needed the literacy circles to be able to get to those sorts of depths and the kids to be able to question. So those type of strategies would work well for him. And as I said, we'd be looking for something that's got some element of discussion and collaboration to it, which those two above strategies do for the reasons that I just mentioned. And we'd be looking at lots of sort of rich tasks, whether it's maybe have some inquiry base to it where we could get him to go off and do his own research, but we'd want him to be evaluating, analysing and questioning when he's doing those sorts of tasks. And we wouldn't want it to, I suppose, open or airy-fairy. We would really want to sit down with the grade 6 curriculum and look up particular things that he needs to be covering so that we make sure that he is doing the things that he needs to be doing. Obviously, he needs to be doing lots of independent reading of texts that are of his choice, and even pushing him to read more challenging texts. So this could be where you go off and do your own independent research. But I was reading a book. You could look it up. It's called No More Lack of Support for Independent Reading. I'll give you the exact title. I'll pop it on the announcement or something. There was a kind of lack of support for independent reading. So it talked about the fact that, we want kids to have a large range of independent reading texts, and we want them to be challenging, because the research shows that the highest level of growth happens when you're actually reading a book that's just slightly above or slightly too hard for you. Just reading the same at your own reading level over and over and over, you could read 100 books and still not make much progress. Whereas you could read 10 books that were really a little bit, not overly challenging to the frustration level, but a little bit challenging, a little bit hard, that actually pushed and extended you, and you would make more growth in that time reading less books but more challenging books. So that's what I'd be pushing Simon to do, and perhaps letting him select some texts, but also suggesting some texts that have those sort of deeper level themes. Henin has completely different needs to Simon, so even though they're in the same grade, I'm taking a different approach with her. So we're talking about the fact that she needs exposure to lots of different concepts, and as much as we can in the time that we have. So things like guided reading and shared reading are going to be great strategies for her, because we could start with the shared reading of a particular text. Our focus could be vocab, our focus could be genre development, things that are going to expose her to a lot of different concepts and a lot of different, I suppose, vocab and word type, and exposure to different types of text. That's what really we want to focus on. So you could model that explicitly, having a vocab focus in your shared reading, and then go off in a guided reading, so that you're still giving her the support that she needs. You could look at things to do with exposure to multiple texts, or even things like a close reading. If you have a look, just Google close reading on Google, and you will see that close reading focuses on the fact that not all of the information is given in the first reading. It takes like a staggered approach. So in the first reading, the kids will have a particular focus of something that they're looking for in the text, and it would just give Hanin the chance to sort of focus in on one particular thing, whether it's words or synonyms or particular genres. She'll just have a particular focus. Then they read it again in the second reading with a different kind of focus, and then they read it again with a more of a comprehension-based focus. So it's giving her that multiple exposures and repeated exposures to that particular text. We could work on daily independent reading with her, but perhaps modeling or monitoring her text selection, so that she's really something that I would focus on her in her independent reading. Again, this is different from Simon, so this is what I'm talking about, where the same strategy can be applied but for different reasons. So even though I've got Simon doing the independent reading and he's looking at challenging texts, and I've got Hanin who's completely different but still using independent reading, but her focus is to have, if she's got 7 books in her book box, one could be a magazine, one could be a comic, one could be an information text about something she likes, and one could be a novel, picture book, so that she's just getting a broad range of lots of different genres, lots of different text types, exposure to information presented in lots of different ways. So that would be my focus for her with her independent reading, is more text selection, I suppose, whereas Simon has a different focus. So see how we can make that work with each of our kids, just with bearing their needs in mind. Now Tegan's going to need a lot of support because she's already unfortunately struggling. Go off and do some research about what we can do with students who are struggling with comprehension. We did some research a few years ago at a school we were at that looked at the idea of repeated readings. So the idea was that students who spend a lot of their memory space, I suppose, in their brain just getting through the decoding part. Now, it tells us that Tegan has no issues with decoding, so it's not that I'm saying she needs to work on the decoding, but a lot of students spend a lot of brain space getting through the decoding part. So the decoding could be absolutely fine, but what they've realized is they get to the bottom of the page, and because they've been concentrating on not making any decoding errors and getting through the piece nicely, they've actually tuned out to what's been said in the piece, and therefore comprehension is lacking. So they found that if they gave kids the opportunity, we even did it for homework at one point where we'd give the students the text and say, go off and read this 10 times. Come back, we're going to talk about it in class. So the comprehension-based focus could be in a guided reading session where you then break down the text and talk about it in terms of what comprehension strategy you want to focus on, but they've had the repeated readings and they know the text really well, so they're coming to you with a bit of insight rather than let's just read it once for the first time, it's completely unfamiliar, I'm going to ask you 5 comprehension questions and you're not going to know how to answer them. So we're providing them that scaffolding by giving them lots of time to read, lots of repeated readings, and then come to me and let's see if we can work on these comprehension strategies with you. We could have some shared reading where we just explicitly model the skills. So remember, in a shared reading, it is the teacher modeling exactly what we want the kids to be able to do. So we are going to explicitly model some comprehension strategies with her. So the teacher would sit down and say, today we're focusing on visualizing, and this is exactly how you visualize. And she would step by step go through it so that Tegan's able to watch it and then hopefully go back to the table herself, whether it's independent or whether it's guided, but she'd be able to use the skills that she just saw the teacher modeling to her. Whether you want to suggest some sort of peer idea, that's completely up to you. That could work well, I suppose, in so that she doesn't always feel like she's got to be with the teacher. I know that some struggling kids think, oh, great, I'm with the teacher again. Oh, great, I'm with the teacher again. So maybe suggesting some sort of peer or buddy help and maybe providing some research about how that's beneficial. And lots of visual stuff probably could be good for Tegan as well. If you were talking about different text types, maybe giving her some graphic organisers to help just organise her ideas could help her with some of her comprehension strategies as well. So 30% of the grade also goes to inclusion methods. So we need to talk about how we are going to, change our ways of teaching to be able to accommodate these particular students, because we have lots of students, and this is just 3 out of a whole grade, but we'd have lots of students that we need to make changes and adapt our program so that we are catering for them. So these are just some ideas that I have come up with. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, it's just some ideas to get you started. But when I think of inclusion methods, we're thinking about, I'm going to jump straight to number 2, which is teaching approaches. So as we saw on the past slide, some teaching approaches can fit all students and you just justify your reasoning for using them in different ways. Not all teaching approaches will suit everybody though. So obviously someone like Tegan, I wouldn't suggest a literacy circle because she doesn't have the comprehension knowledge to be able to pull that off in a group situation without teacher support. So that is not an appropriate teaching strategy for her. So we need to vary them. We can't use the same. Sometimes it works that we can all use the same, like I've justified independent reading for all of them, but there will be other approaches that just don't work. So you're going to have to make changes to the teaching strategies and approaches depending on the student's needs. Now, that's just a given and that makes sense to us all, I'm sure. But as well as changes to the how of what you're teaching, does that make sense? No, the how of getting the information across, you also need to be able to provide these other things. So things like multiple pathways. So there shouldn't just be one way of getting from A to B. So it's not going to work for every student. You can't specify that every student, all 25 students in the grade are all going to go A, B, and C. It doesn't work for all students. So there could be other ways that you change certain things to make the pathway different, so that getting from A to C can still be achieved, but you don't go through B, you go through Z. So you're giving students the opportunity to get to an end point in a couple of different ways. You can make changes to your routines and procedures. It might be that Tegan needs more time. It might be that you're suggesting, I know with at-risk students, I like to see them more often. So perhaps Simon needs touching base with once a week, but for an hour. and get those rich conversations happening with him and get the conferencing happening. And he might not need to touch base with you so often because you've had quite an in-depth conversation and you can set some learning goals and meet with him again next week. Whereas perhaps Tegan, you need to meet with her every day. You need to do something with her every day for 15 minutes. So they're still getting the same amount of teacher time, but the way you structure your routines and procedures in the classroom are different because you're catering to what the particular student needs. There could be flexible grouping. So at some point, you're going to need to, have students together for abilities. Like I said that with Simon in a literacy circle, I want other kids who are at his level who are able to provide that in-depth discussion. But there'll be other times when I'd want Simon to be working with other students in different learning situations so that students like Tegan and Hanin get the benefit of watching how Simon reads and how he implements strategies and perhaps sharing and reflection. And there'll be other times when he can learn from different group situations as well. Obviously, we need to modify the tasks, so we shouldn't be expecting that all 3 students are going to complete the exact same task. So you can suggest how you could make some modifications to the tasks that are being expected. We could be giving feedback. So as we're assessing or as we're roaming around, I've also got roaming over there too, we can be giving some really explicit feedback about how the student is going and something that they can do for the rest of the lesson to help keep them focused and keep moving that learning forward. Obviously, we're going to use data to inform our teaching. We might vary the speed and delivery. And of course, modelling is a big focus because it helps for those struggling students to learn explicitly from you what skills are needed to complete the task. Our next thing that we need to know is about inclusive assessment. So not all assessments are going to suit all students. And again, you need to be able to justify your choice. So when I read your assessment choice, or when your ELA reads your assessment choice, I should think, that kind of assessment makes sense for what Tegan needs. Or that kind of assessment would suit Simon and it would actually give me some informative information to be able to progress him to the next level. So for example, if I wanted some inclusive assessment types, well, actually none of these students need a decoding test, but particularly not Simon, who's already working at grade 6 level. So I think that's a bit of a given, but I just put it there to give you an example that none of these students, maybe with the exception of Tegan, but she's good at decoding, so I take that back. None of them need a running record-based assessment, just as an example of something that's not appropriate. So with Simon, what is appropriate? So what I would be suggesting with him is that he is capable of showing you lots of different formative assessment types and even self-assessment because he has insight into his own learning. I would assume that a grade 4 who's working at grade 6 level could give you quite a big quite a big insight into how they learn and what they learn. They would be able to provide you with some sort of high quality self-assessment that perhaps other kids in the grade couldn't. I like the idea of lots of reading conferencing with him because you'd be able to sit down and have that sort of, and I would make it longer because I would have a bit more of an in-depth conversation with him about how he thinks he's traveling with his learning goals. You could even get him to set learning goals for himself, obviously with your guidance. But a reading conference would provide you with that time to sit down with him and really discuss what it is that he needs to be able to do to move him to the next level. We need to be able to have perhaps things, there could be some sort of summative tests that are appropriate to him. I know there's lots of comprehension-based tests like Probe that test right up to age 14 or 15. So that would still give you information that you could use, and it could potentially give you some information about what strategies still need to be developed. These are sort of more reading-based ones. If you wanted to focus on writing as well, you could also focus on what parts of writing he could be using. I know a lot of my examples sort of end up being reading based because I feel like that's my strong point, but obviously writing is fine to use as an example as well. So Hanin, we just need to be conscious that if we give her some standardized tests that we're not setting her up for failure. So I know there was, I'm not even sure if they use it anymore, but there was a test called Torch, and it was like a closed test. It had a story and then some missing words that you had to fill in. And I often found that some of my EAL students struggled because it often used to be a story about kids who did something like go bike riding, and there'd be specific words to do with bikes, and sometimes some of the language was, I suppose, culturally specific or things that didn't quite make sense to them all the time, and it wasn't an appropriate test in that I knew some of these kids could comprehend quite well. It was just, the sort of concepts that they didn't understand just because the vocab was unfamiliar. So we wouldn't want to set her up for, I suppose, failure, knowing that it's not a comprehension issue, it's a test issue. So just be mindful of choosing tests that are appropriate to her or help to give us as much information about her as possible. I think with Hanin, we need to make sure that there's multiple forms of assessment. So we wouldn't want all, which is the case with all the students. We don't want all summative or all formative. We want to have a nice mixture of both. Conferencing is going to work really well with her too. That could probably go across all students for different reasons, which you'd need to justify why you've chosen it. But conferencing with Hanin, I would do it more often than I did it with Simon. Because I'd want to check in with her about how she was going with her guided reading. Sorry, not guided reading, independent reading. It would be a chance for me to check in how she was going with that in terms of text selection and ensuring that she read really widely of lots of different text types and structures. Tegan, we just need to be mindful of the fact that she's probably a bit burnt out on some tests and might feel a bit disengaged and a bit, I can't do this mentality with some of the tests. So we'd have to be, I suppose, a bit mindful of her self-esteem moving forward with some of the testing we want her to do, particularly if they're tricky sort of summative tests that she just might tune out. I think probe could work well with her if you did it in a conferencing situation where you sat down and talked about what strategies she was using so that you're better able to teach to the exact comprehension strategies that she needs. So if she's not evaluating or not reorganizing very well, then they're the two strategies that you would focus on with her. It's really important that we need to be able to get data from this assessment because we need to be able to know how we're going to move these students on with their learning. So we need to, if Tegan's main focus is comprehension, then I would like to see that your assessment type focused on comprehension. So with Tegan, I'd like to see more formative assessment more often. You really need to touch base with struggling students more regularly. So that you'll sort of got a continuous stream of data on how they're progressing. Learning goals is the last one. Learning goals can be written from the student's point of view. So you can see it says I will for my examples here, or they can just be written in terms of what a teacher would set for them. Now, I like my kids to know what their learning goals are, so I have written them in like a first person perspective from the student's point of view, but teacher learning goals are fine as well. So I'm going to start with Hanin to begin with. So the main focus with her, this should lead really nicely back to what we said was her area of diversity. So the whole way through we're sort of traveling upon this one theme of Hanin needs to broaden her vocabulary, she needs to learn unfamiliar words, and she really needs to broaden her scope of lots of different text types so that she's got exposure to more things that she's going to have to comprehend and understand. So her reading goal was one that I just purely made up based on what I know about her and based on what her needs are. So I wrote, I will read a variety of texts such as novels, magazines, comics, and nonfiction. I suppose an extension of that would be that we're monitoring that through I keep saying guided reading, independent reading. We're monitoring that in her independent reading time, where we're touching base with her to see that she is actually selecting books of different types. And perhaps we need to get her to tick off some sort of scorecard that she's done that. Now with Tegan, again, we're following that same theme the whole way through. So we know that her area of need is comprehension. So really, the learning goals should somehow be based around about her need to improve her comprehension. So I have chosen 2 things that I think people who need to work on their comprehension need to do. Now, a lot of time I see kids answer questions and they make it up. So if I said, why did the boy feel sad? They make up their answer and they say, oh, the boy probably felt sad because his cat died. It has absolutely nothing to do with the text, but all they can connect to is a reason. It's a perfectly good reason why you would be sad, but it doesn't relate to the text. So I want her to use evidence from the text to support her answers. And I would figure out different strategies to help her do that, like underlining keywords and main ideas and things like that. We also wanted to be able to form her opinions and give reasons why she thinks that. So once she's been better able to find evidence in the text, we're going to ask her to form an opinion about what she thinks. And I think these 2 strategies would be good to get her to start to work on that level of comprehension. These ones have not been taken from anywhere. I have made them up based on what I know about the 2 students. So you can take that approach if you wish. Simon, I've taken a different approach. I have used the curriculum to give me support, which you can do with the other 2 students too, if you like. So I know that Simon's working at grade 6 level, and I know that I need to progress him from there. So I shouldn't see anything in his learning goals about things that are to do with the grade 4 curriculum, because he's way beyond that. So I've gone into, you could even use grade 5, but preferably grade 6 curriculum. We're going to look in the curriculum and see what Simon needs to be able to do. So I've taken 2 content descriptors and I have reworded them to make them into learning goals for Simon. One of the content descriptors said that you need to understand the difference between objective and subjective language. So that would be something that I could work on with him. So it says, I understand the difference between objective and subjective language. That's something a grade 6 person needs to be able to do. And I can identify bias in a text and discuss the author's intent. That is also something taken directly out of the grade 6 curriculum. I've used it as support to help me to form a learning goal. Now, if you've never written learning goals before, it is tricky and I can't cover it all in this presentation. So during our time in the interactive collab, we will work on how to write learning goals and give you some more support around that. Thanks so much for listening. Please come to the interactive collab in week 6 so that we can give you some more report around these main ideas. And thanks very much.